This is Athens. Well, it's a sidewalk in Athens. Look at this patchwork. Beautiful stuff. Chaotic, maybe a little bit dangerous, but beautiful. I'm here in the capital of Greece, one of the oldest cities in the world, often considered the birthplace of democracy. A funny place to be right now. I'm here soaking up culture, food, architecture, inspiration. I like making little sculptures, miniatures, terrain. Lots of other miniaturists make really impressively neat, tidy, orderly terrain, which is really cool. But I'm more inspired by places like this, places that seem to have been continually patched together for millennia. So today, I'm taking a more chaotic, abstract approach to terrain as I build the foundations of the great city of Ozma. One of Ozma's many sobriquets is the Patchwork City. So composed is it of cluttered and jumbled architecture from different eras and cultures. The city shifts and changes for many reasons, mundane and magical. One of the most famous is Merz, but I'll tell you about that in a moment. As it happens, I have lots of weird insulation foam offcuts from little projects and experiments I'll be repurposing to build the city. Make your lore fit your resources. Today, we're patching together random offcuts and shapes to form the basic building blocks of the city. There'll be modular tiles that I can recombine in endless ways to create different layouts. I don't have a lot of space to store stuff, so I want to get the most out of every piece of terrain I make. And if they're a little more abstract, I can recombine them in more ways to make more interesting environments. So this is a kind of assemblage process, finding shapes that I like and finding interesting ways to stick them together. I sort my scraps by size. I usually start construction with the larger pieces and gradually work my way down to smaller and smaller details. I want to work quickly, sticking stuff together. Hot glue cools and sets fast, and it adheres quite well to foam. Ultimately, I'm fitting pieces together to form blocks, 1 inch high, 4 inches wide, and 4 inches deep. I'm also making some larger and smaller ones, but I'm thinking of 4x1 as the standard size. And at this stage, I'm doing this pretty loosely, allowing for variation within those block shapes, seeing what feels good in the moment. This is one of my favorite things, just bringing bits together to create these new shapes, imagining what they could be and what they can become. All I care about at this stage is that it's at least 4x4 by 1 inches. And that's because the next step is to just cut it down to size and toss the excess back into the offcut bins. Offcuts for the offcut throne. And actually it's good if they're a little oversized because I'm not being very careful about getting right angles when I glue them together. So I trim it down with this hot wire table. I use a trim square held against the workpiece and slide it down the fence to get a square cut. So this is going to be a 4x4 tile, but I also go as low as 2 inches and as high as 8 inches on a side. The tiling method I'm using just requires their lengths and widths to be multiples of 2. You'll see why soon. So this is a Proxon hot wire table. It's kind of the standard for working with foam. You can also make these cuts with a knife if you're careful, but this is way easier and more precise. And precision is extra important for making modular terrain because everything has to fit together nicely. This MDF fence is made by Shifting Lands, who make all kinds of hot wire table accessories. The standard fence the Proxon comes with is pretty flimsy. This one provides a much larger, more rigid and solid surface. So once I've got all the other edges squared off, I cut this down to 4 inches. And that's nice and square. I'm going to use this jig I made to poke holes for magnets on all the corners of the tiles. The important bit is a 1 inch square basswood sheet that I stuck a thumbtack through the middle of. I then sheathed the thumbtack in a 3mm styrene tube, as most of the magnets I'll be using are 3mm in diameter. But before I start adding magnets, I want to fill in a little more of this tile. So first I want to fill this hole. Wedge that in there. Doesn't quite fit. So I shave off a little extra, and that's nice and snug. Glue it up, and in it goes. And the same kind of thing over here. Now I want a little texture for this triangular depression in the floor, so I'm using another triangle as a guide to cut the correct angle on a thin piece of foam. Glue it up, and that's the fit I want. I take the remainder and flip it around and pop it in there for a little channel. Shave off this edge and start adding in some other junk. In this case, a little snip of wire mesh. Snip, snip, in it goes, and another bit of foam for this corner. Trim it a bit. Cool, cool. These are tiny but powerful 3x2mm neodymium disc magnets in N52 grade. That's a very high grade, high strength magnet. There's also N48, N35, and so on. The lower the number, the weaker and usually cheaper it is. So this is my magnetic tile system. Others have done this before me, this is just my take on it. I'm going with inch-thick tiles, adding height variations and deep textures. So the reason the tiles have lengths and widths that are all multiples of 2 inches is because each edge has magnets alternating polarity each inch along the edge. So every 2 inches, the polarity cycle repeats. Now, spots can be skipped, but the polarity needs to be taken into account. So the sides of these tiles always start with red, then blue, then red, then blue, and so on. And each edge is going to have a minimum of 2 magnets, one at each end, red on the left, blue on the right. By doing it this way, the tiles can be rotated into any orientation and still stick to each other as long as they're aligned or offset by a multiple of 2 inches. It's very versatile. Additionally, the faces pointing up get magnets in the blue polarity, and the faces pointing down get red, so they can stack. To save money, I actually use a combination of these magnets in essential places and cheaper stuff like steel tacks everywhere else. Using these together makes for weaker bonds, but it cuts the cost way down. Ultimately, it comes down to your use case and budget. If you can afford it, going with all high-strength magnets would work great. Or you can go my route with a combo of high-strength magnets and cheap bits of steel and iron. Or it might make more sense to go for all weaker but cheaper magnets. I'd recommend grabbing a variety of magnets and experimenting to see what works for you. Some hobby sites like the Magnet Baron have magnet bundles, but the best deals for bulk magnets will come from dedicated magnet sales sites like JC Magnetics or K&J Magnetics in the US, Spider Magnetics in the UK, and various others around the world. The RP Archive channel has a nice list of international magnet sellers. And with a quick test, that's a good start. The big flat area here could use a little texture, like a nice little grid of tiles. So I'm marking off every 1/8 of an inch with a knife on both sides, and scoring it. Do the same in the other direction. And then I widen those lines with a pen. And get that edge too. Did you know there are different kinds of glue stick? This one is from Surebonder. It's their professional grade glue. And it does seem to do a bit of a better job holding onto the magnets than their standard glue. I wouldn't bother with it for foam-to-foam connections. The standard stuff works great for that. But the magnets can be strong enough that they just pop out when you're pulling pieces apart. So it's nice to have a stronger option. So while the Pro Glue does seem to work a bit better, it is still hot glue with all the annoyances that comes with. You get all these stringy bits everywhere, and it's pretty messy. I did find out, after gluing all the magnets, that there's such a thing as foam-safe CA glue. Whoop. So if you use regular CA glue on foam, it'll melt the foam. But there's some other formulation, I guess, that doesn't do this. You'll see it make an appearance later in the video. Okay, here's another magnet jig. It's a 4x1 inch strip of styrene with 4 holes drilled in it, and a magnet glued in each hole with alternating polarity. The idea being I stick a loose magnet on each of these and line the whole thing up and press them into the foam. And I get some holes out of it that are perfectly positioned and exactly magnet sized. So the reason I originally made this magnetic jig with alternating polarity was to use it on the edges of tiles like this. thinking I could put glue down and insert 4 magnets at once. But in the end, it wound up being easier to just do them one by one. It's still useful though. Also, getting some big tacks in here. I didn't use that many because they cover up so much of the surface texture, but they seem like they'll work if used sparingly. As I go, if I find details I like, I can use a pencil or pen to trace them and help them pop a bit. I can even make little tile textures this way, though it's not my favorite method. It's not really as crisp as I'd like. I also try out using some of these little screws as magnetic anchor points, and they seem to work pretty well. Are you ready to make a bazillion tiny tiles? No? Well, that's too bad. This is just a blank playing card. I get these in bulk for game prototyping, but they also work nicely for tile work. You can use any kind of thin card for this, like a cereal box or whatever. I measure out dimensions and cut it into lots of little tiles. It helps to have a podcast on or a lengthy crafting video while you're doing this. And it all goes on nicely with a thin layer of PVA glue. I just look for blank areas that could use a bit of visual interest and use the tiles as texture. I also leave some gaps in the tiles and cut some into pieces to make broken tiles. It looks more interesting, and this is meant to be a well-worn, lived-in place. This is the biggest piece I'm making, a full 8 by 8 inches. I don't want to tile the whole surface, so I'm laying down little patches of tiles, more to suggest a larger texture than actually render it. Still gets quite a few tiles, in various shapes and sizes though. Here's some more junk from a previous experiment. All these little shapes I cut out of card can go together and make a nice little hexagon. So that's going to be the central feature of this otherwise rather simple tile. Some kind of design made from stone blocks, their meaning lost to time. And that's it for tiles. Get out of here. Just kidding, there's going to be way more tiles. Back at it again with the white glue. Now these are chopped up bits of cured epoxy putty, leftovers once again from previous projects. I poke them into place with this pokey thing, made from a handle of some sort, green stuff, and a pin. And while I do that, let me tell you a little story. After all, this is all part of a great city. The oldest city. The City, the patchwork city. Ozma. Once upon a time in Ozma, in the artist's quarter of Merz, there lived a poor boy who had come to be known to history and legend by the name Arcanaman Ulva. In his youth, Merz was a rough and difficult place. Artists, aside from the select few who caught the eye of the imperial court, were among the lowest classes in society. Ulva's parents were both painters. His father painted signs, and his mother wallpaper. His mother was a painter of some renown who had fallen from grace and lost her right hand when she was accused by a nobleman of witchcraft and painting secret hexes into the wallpaper he had commissioned for his bedroom. He claimed he had been cursed, but the talk amongst the servants was that his impotence long predated the installation of her wallpaper. But so it goes with nobility. Ulva grew up as his mother's apprentice, learning the techniques and symbology of wallpaper design, as well as romantic landscapes, as were often requested by the nobles and merchants who'd once given her commissions. Ulva loved his parents and many of their friends, who were also artists, also destitute. He was sickened and saddened by the state of their district, Merz, which, despite its creative vigor, was squalid, run down, and dangerous. But there was no way out. No way to bring life back to the dying district. As his parents grew old and Ulva struggled to make his way, he began painting grand landscapes on scrap wallpaper, with paints he scraped and stole to obtain. And he submitted them to the Osman Salon, a grand exhibition where he hoped desperately that one would catch the eye of a potential patron. Little did he expect that one of these paintings would become not only the talk of the town, but also the first in a series of increasingly dangerous controversies that would shape his life. We'll come back to that shortly. Back to the build. Ozma has quite a lot of plant life growing all around and through it, so we can get some flocking on there to create dirt, grass, and moss textures. The stuff is flock from Woodland Scenics, but you can make your own with sawdust, tea leaves, coffee grounds, lots of options. So one thing you'll hear from a lot of people who make stuff like this is that you can get great shapes from takeout food containers. This is true. I mean, look at this thing. I think some grocery store sushi came in it. The problem is these containers are pretty terrible to actually construct with. They're flimsy, and nothing sticks to them. But they can make for lovely molds, say for air-dry clay, like DOS. Miscast did a video on this recently using plaster, which is probably a better method than what I'm doing. But the air-dry clay works well enough for my purposes, and it's what I have on hand. The next day, it's all dry. A little cracked here and there, but that's no problem. And it comes out fairly easily. And there it is. That's lovely. All these nice little hexagons. So then I cut off the excess. So now, what to do with all this? I have this ramp tile that goes from 1 to 2 inches elevation, and I think these little hexagons would make for great paving stones here. So I line them up and cut them down. And it looks like they'll fit up to here, so I cut them again. And now this is going to go on a little flat area at the bottom. So I'm cutting back and forth, winding around the hexes to create a kind of interlocking tooth. Glue it up. There's a little gap on the end here, so I'll use a little strip of basswood to fill that in. Just push it down into the glue and let it set up. Once it's set, I just cut the excess sticking off the end here. And with that little amuse-bouche, it's time for the main course. Here I'm replicating that interlocking tooth where the two pieces will join. I feel like I don't see people using palette knives very often in this space, which is wild to me. It's one of my most used tools. Alright, lay that down. Chop the top, and fill gaps with some of the excess hexagons. Some irregularity here is totally fine. And that's that. A few more tiles will get smaller hexagon treatments. Time for some pastes. First is spackle. You can get a tub of this at any hardware store. It's lightweight, dries pretty quickly, and is very easy to spread. Here I'm using it to cover some seams, fill some gaps, and hide some magnets. Of course, I don't want to obliterate all the details, but I want to be deliberate about which ones I keep, and I definitely don't want the magnets to be too obvious. This also helps hide some of the texture of the foam. I also use acrylic modeling paste for this. I find it tends to be a bit heavier and tougher than spackle, which can be good for more exposed bits or areas that need more shaping. Anyway, pastes aren't all that interesting to talk about, so back to our friend, Argonaman Ulva. The painting that Ulva showed in the Osmond Salon, the painting that would catapult him from utter obscurity to sudden controversial fame, was a piece simply titled Merz, named for his neighborhood. It caused such a stir not because of its impressive size, though it was massive, nor for its style, as it was painted in a quite traditional romantic style, favored by the nobility for decorative pieces, nor even because it was a painting of Merz, a notoriously squalid quarter. It caused a stir because it was all of these things. It was a magnificent, grandiose, romantic depiction of one of the worst, filthiest, most dangerous places in the city. And it made that place look more grand and regal than the imperial palace itself. In this monumental painting, Argonaman Ulva had reimagined the district of Merz as beautiful, prosperous, and proud. And the nobility at the salon nearly rioted. Factions emerged claiming that Ulva was mocking the emperor with the painting. Others claimed he was elevating the lowly above their station. Still others, recognizing his mother's condemned technique in his work, claimed that the painting was some kind of witchcraft and demanded it be burned at once. This, of course, led other nobles, often the rivals of those most upset by it, to laud it as a work of imaginative genius and commission works from the new artist that they could unveil and show off at galas and balls. Over the course of the exhibition, many people noted that something strange was happening in Ulva's neighborhood of Merz. The streets were getting cleaner, shops were opening, life was returning for the first time in decades, and the neighborhood began to look a bit more like the painting. The arguments then became about whether the controversy around the painting had simply created interest in Merz, driven business to it, and inspired a revitalization. Or, as some furious lords kept insisting, it was vile witchcraft, a spell in painting form. The continued controversy and fascination led Ulva to pick up many commissions, and though he refused to sell the painting of Merz, he became quite wealthy quite quickly, painting portraits. He created a grand studio in the newly fashionable Merz district, where his subjects would walk under the great romantic landscape that had catapulted him to fame, to sit for hours as he painted their portraits. Every one of his portraits flatters its subject, showing them more beautiful, more wealthy, more powerful, and like the great painting, they seem to influence their lives. Those who are painted by Arcanum and Ulva see their stars align and their fortunes grow. They seem more attractive to everyone around them, and more likely to get the Emperor's ear. Ulva's portraits come to be in high demand, but they also come to be seen as good luck talismans and glamours. His portraits become a de facto requirement for those seeking to rise in the court. Even the Emperor himself had a portrait made, which he hung proudly in the palace. Even as he reached unimaginable levels of success, Ulva was continually plagued by scandals. Courtiers claiming that he had been paid by their rivals to make unflattering, secret paintings of them to sabotage them. Accusations of Ulva favoring certain clients over others, and of course the cries of witchcraft never subsided. But the biggest scandal of all was when Innis, daughter of Lord Hetu, a powerful nobleman and marshal to the Emperor, eloped with Ulva, who had recently painted her portrait. That Ulva was a low-born arriviste was one thing, but she had also already been betrothed to a foreign king, Gamura. The marriage was to secure a political alliance with Gamura's powerful kingdom. Her father, Lord Hetu, became furious. He sent spies to break into Ulva's studio in Merz while Ulva and Innis were away, and there they uncovered a hidden trove of small painting studies depicting Innis falling in love with Ulva. To make matters worse, many of these were also quite erotic, to put it charitably. Flushed with embarrassment and rage, Hetu hides these away in the imperial vault. Soon thereafter, an envoy from King Gamura arrives at the imperial court with a proclamation. The king has learned that Innis has been wed to a common artist after having been promised to him. This is a grave insult and betrayal. He has therefore gathered his considerable armies and set sail to lay siege to the city of Ozma. Okay, back to that in part 3. Let's see what's next for the build. For our third paste, we have Grout. Grout is grittier than spackle and modeling paste, so it's nice for creating rougher texture, which can imply things like stucco, rough stone, or dirt. And while that's going on, if you're enjoying this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, blah blah blah. And extra special thanks to everyone who supports my work, both on YouTube and at my website, paradiso.zone. You are amazing, lovely people. And thanks for your patience. These videos take a long time to make, especially this one. Without you, none of this would be possible. Thank you so much. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube, or better yet, at my website, paradiso.zone. In addition to supporting the channel and seeing your name in lights, there's a whole bunch of tabletop game-related rewards you can get. And at the top tier, you'll see your name permanently inscribed into the Train of Ozma in a future video. So how about that? Anyway, thanks again. Let's get back to it. Let's do this stop motion style. Yeah, that's fun. Here, I'm just feeling the need for more and more tiles, and details, and things. A lot of this kind of project just comes down to a bizarre dedication to, and maybe fascination with, minutia. There's something very soothing about it, almost meditative. Okay, this bit is different, not tiles. I'm gonna make a coil of hose or cable or something. This is some green stuff epoxy putty, great for sculpting. I've just rolled out a long, thin spaghetto of it and let it cure on parchment paper. I then wind it up and hold it together with CA glue, which I splash on pretty liberally, and the occasional spritz of superglue accelerant cures it instantly. And I just keep doing that until I have a coil I like the look of. That's a nice spot. So, with some of that foam-safe CA glue I mentioned earlier, I can affix it on there, directly onto the foam. And I'll make it look kind of like it's coming out of this pipe thing, which, as long as we're here, could use some more detail too. Here I'm tracing one of the holes on some wire mesh. I cut that out with some snips, and I just gotta wedge it in there. And I do a partial one on the left. Maybe someone cut it to add an illegal power or water hookup. Another thing the various putties and goops are useful for is blending in the details. You can see I've done that with a lot of the tile work I did before, and now I'm just filling the seam with this little wood block I glued here. I also like gooping up the deep cracks, so it's like sediment has accumulated there. It also helps conceal some of the rough edges I made when cutting foam with a less than razor sharp knife. Taking the time to fill little seams like this helps to ground everything, and helps to make the pieces feel more solid, which is generally what you want for terrain. Otherwise, it ends up being a little too obvious that it's just foam bits glued together. And here you can see I've actually used some modeling paste to add a little extra geometry. This little slope by the step. Here's a fun little piece of plastic. No idea where it came from, but it kind of looks like an exhaust fan, so that's what it's going to be. I don't want it to stick out from the roof here, so I press it in to get an impression, which I then cut along and use pliers to gouge the foam out. Chop the top and pop it in. A little modeling paste smooths out the rough cut, and this little extra ring impression. Looking good. As long as we're cutting holes, might as well make some windows. Checking my scale reference with a 28mm mini to make a doorway. And I add little strips of wood for molding. And the base of the door will be this card. It's a good fit. Tack it in place and cut the excess. I'm sticking a little textured plastic from a food container in this window. Nice. Did the same here. Now I just want to decorate it a bit with some implied stonework. We need more doors. One does not simply walk into more doors. Same procedure. Cut the outline, gouge the innards. Not totally sure what this will be. Mostly I'm just cutting a notch to break up the silhouette a little bit. Another little window over here. Ooh, this will be like a basement or dungeon window. And some more stonework. Going over it all with a toothpick or a pen helps define the lines. Little bits of basswood and styrene tubing are great for adding little details, but you can also use toothpicks or coffee stirrers or straws. It can be nice to have some purpose-made supplies, but with a little foraging, it's often not necessary. More windows. Darken the recesses with black paint and Mod Podge, and use tiny bits of wood to board them up. Plus a cute little skull from the Citadel Skulls box. And another dungeony gate. I measured this bit of wood to size, and cut and glue two of them together. Now I'm gingerly gluing tacks onto this base. This was really fiddly and frustrating, even for me, so don't use this method. Pushing it in place was satisfying at least. Mod Podge is a special craft glue that's a mix of PVA glue and some kind of varnish. This makes it good not just for sticking stuff together, but also for sealing and protecting the outsides of pieces. I like to mix it with paint and some water to get white podge, which I can use both as a sealer and a primer of sorts. And then I do the same with black paint to make black podge, which I use mostly for the undersides of pieces and for darker or more recessed areas. Okay, that's not really readable anymore, is it? Hold on. That's better. So for most of these pieces, I cover the visible areas, the tops and sides, with a thin layer of white podge, making sure to give the flocking a good soak to fix it in place fully. And the undersides get the black podge, 2 or 3 layers. Though I also try out black on top of a few to see how they paint up. In the end, it doesn't make much of a difference, but it's good for getting into darker recesses. Once everything is all podged up, we're ready to add even more details. More tiles, of course. More green stuff tubing, this time rolled out with Green Stuff World's Rollmaker XL. a tool for making textured strands just like this. A note about the roll maker. There are two versions, the regular roll maker and the XL. Something they don't make very clear is that for the XL, not only are the plates bigger, but the textures are bigger too. The smallest XL texture is coarser than the largest regular texture. They're both useful, but my recommendation would be to get the XL if you're making terrain, and get the regular for sculpting miniatures and kit bashing. If I were to only get one, I'd probably get the regular, because the regular can still be used for terrain. It's just not ideal, while the XL is just too coarse for a lot of minis. Anyway, whenever I have excess epoxy putty, I tend to break out the rollers and make a bunch of these little cables, which, as you can see, comes in very handy when I have big gaps to fill, like this one. A little flock can help hide the seams. For this next detail, I want to use this plastic bit for its ribbed texture, so I'm tracing around it with a craft knife for another good old cut and gouge, and fitting it in there. It looks less like a door and more like a piece of machinery, like a radiator or heat sink, so I want to run some wires out from it. Something I think a lot about when building things. It's easy to see one of something as a mistake, but two of that thing, especially when they're lined up, will almost always be seen as deliberate. In this case, the wire feels a bit too random on its own, so I think it needs a second parallel wire to make it feel like it's supposed to be there. I have these wire bending pliers for just this task. A little CA glue and a dash of baking soda to instantly cure it and add a little texture. And while I add more details in, let's get back to the story. A few days after King Gamura's declaration of war, Lord Hetu is bedridden, feeling weak and feverish, but is still sending orders to the Osman Guard to close the ports and defend the city. Of necessity, his attention is turned to defense, but he is interrupted by his worried seneschal, who hands him a letter, returning him to the problem of his daughter and her lover, the scoundrel artist, Arcanum Ulva. The letter is from Ulva himself, written in a panicked and furious hand. It is a screed denouncing Lord Hetu for the break-in and theft of his most precious private paintings. The end of the letter takes on a mad, frenzied tone. You are trying to ruin everything I've worked so hard for, but I will not let you do any more harm. Turning to the second page of the letter, Lord Hetu sees his own face, the portrait in the signature Ulva style, that the brushstrokes are rougher, more frenetic. But in this portrait, Hetu's face is withered and corroded with a horrible flesh-eating disease. Lord Hetu's rotting body is discovered later that day, clutching the letter and the portrait in clenched fists. News of the Lord's death, and what would later become known as the Killing Portrait, soon makes its way to the Emperor's council. The counselors look at each other with terror in their eyes, the portraits they'd had commissioned suddenly seeming like nooses around their necks. The uncomfortable thought they'd buried in their lust for power and fame suddenly brought to the fore. What if someone were to alter them, or worse, destroy them? Are they at the mercy of their own portraits? It is just then that the captain of the guard alerts them to a break-in to the royal gallery. Spies of the foreign King Gamura must have also gotten word. They have attempted to steal numerous Ulva portraits. The guards killed some of them, but others got away. Several portraits are now missing, including one of the Emperor himself. A chorus of horror and rage erupts from the council chambers. They curse Ulva's name, decrying him as a foul sorcerer, and the Emperor calls for his execution. As the invading army lands their ships and fight their way through the disordered city defenses, Ulva and Innis barricade themselves in Ulva's home in Merz. After days of fighting, Gamura's army surround the imperial palace. Standing out in the plaza with a shroud covering his face, King Gamura holds up the missing portrait of the Emperor. His spies have told him of the witch painter's power. He demands his bride-to-be, Innis, be presented to him, or he will destroy the portrait, and with it, the Emperor himself. The Emperor sends messengers out, and word of Gamura's demand reaches Ulva and Innis in Merz. Ulva begs Innis to flee the city with him, but she refuses to go into exile and abandon her home. She proposes a scheme instead. She will go to King Gamura's camp and turn herself in, accompanied by Ulva, disguised as her manservant. Attending her, Ulva will have the opportunity to see the foreign king's face, then escape to his studio to paint a portrait with which to dominate or kill him. Ulva will become a hero. Seeing that Innes will not be dissuaded, Ulva acquiesces to her plan. They disguise him and go to King Gamura's camp. The foreign king is delighted to see Innes, though he never takes off the veil obscuring his face. He largely ignores her attendant, who remains by her side, sneaking furtive glances at the foreign king. "So kind of you to come of your own accord," purrs Gamura. An exchange would have been much more complicated to negotiate with the Emperor. But now I have everything, and I won't be needing this anymore. With a single motion, he unsheaths his sword and slashes the painting of the Emperor across the neck. Alright, back to the story soon. How about we start painting? Time to prime. I use Vallejo flat gray primer in an airbrush, which I quite like, but there are really so many ways to do this. You can always brush primer on, but it's not very fun and it takes forever. Plus it's hard to get an even coat. If you don't have an airbrush, I'd recommend just rattle canning it. In the past, I've used primer spray paint from the hardware store, which has worked just fine. I've also heard people really like the Tamiya spray primer and some other hobby-specific primers. I've never used them myself, but I might give them a try someday. Anyway, whichever way you go about it, you want to get a thin, even coat all over. Going too thick, you can get pooling, lose detail, and so on. If too much of whatever's underneath is still showing through, it's best to just let it dry and give it another thin coat. Same general technique goes for colors. These need to get thinned a bit with airbrush medium. Painting this stuff isn't like winter, it's like autumn. You don't want one big bulky coat, you want a layer, you know? Here you can see I have a big chunk of cork with a magnet embedded in it that I'm using to hold on to the tiles. One of the advantages of doing magnetized builds. I made all this before going to Greece, but I've been to other places in or around the Mediterranean, and I take a lot of inspiration from the region. As described in episode 1 when I was building stairs, I'm going for a lighter, warmer color scheme, inspired by the limestone so prevalent in the region. One thing that might seem a little unusual about this color scheme is that the darker areas are a bit warmer, generally brown with some red, orange, or purple mixed in, while some of the highlights are cooler, with more whites and blues. This reflects what I've seen on some limestone formations and structures in the real world. A color tip. It's easy to assume that since white is light and black is dark, that if you mix those into a color, you'll get a good highlight or shadow of that color. But while you do get a brighter or darker tone, you are also desaturating the color. This is why highlighting and shading with just black and white gives such muddy results. You're basically just mixing shades of gray into everything. Black and white are very useful for getting that light-dark shift, to be sure, but they're best used with other colors. This means that colors can, and often should, shift a bit in hue when getting into highlights and shadows. Colors have different perceptual qualities. We tend to perceive warm colors, yellows, oranges, and reds, as brighter and more prominent, while cool colors, your blues and greens, tend to recede and feel darker. So it's quite common to have highlights get a little warmer, say by mixing in some yellow, and have shadows get cooler, maybe mixing in some blue. So with this color scheme, I'm going a little bit against our expectations of these colors, sometimes getting cooler as I go lighter and warmer as I go darker. Here's the palette I made in episode 1 that I still use as a loose reference point for this terrain. And you can see that the right and upper parts of the palette have a lot of the stone hues, from the pale yellows and blues down to the burnt orange. And then as you go down from burnt orange, it gets cooler again with dark purpley brown hues. Now, I'm not following this palette religiously by any means, but I do bring it up because I think it can be easy to overlook the colors in nature and the ways they shift. Most stone isn't gray. Most gray stone isn't gray. Look closely and you'll see little flecks and subtle hints of color. And colors rarely just get darker or lighter linearly. They tend to transition into and between other hues instead. Anyway, With these brown tones, I'm mostly going for cracks and other recessed areas, spaces between tiles, things like that. Plus, I'm trying to get the sides a little darker than the tops. Overspray is totally fine at this stage. This is really rough, but I'll refine everything as I go. Here I'm feeling like some areas aren't warm enough, so I do a very light mist of orange. This doesn't need to be even. And now, getting into some lighter areas with some more blue and white mixed into the flesh tone. Mostly just hitting the tops, not being too particular about overspray. Okay, here's the bit where I tell you about some of the other stuff I have going on real quick. I have an online store at paradiso.works. You can buy the physical book form of the, dare I say it, critically acclaimed Mothership RPG module I made, called Warped Beyond Recognition. Plus you can get the patch and the shirt to go with it. Also, I'm continually making a big book of tables for Mothership, also useful for other sci-fi RPGs. That book is called Hundreds, and it contains lots of very flavorful D100 tables to help you run games. I'm continuing to add lots more, and as I do, the price goes up, so get it early and you'll get all future updates for free. Go to paradiso.oo/100 to get your copy of Hundreds. My Dungeon 23 Mega Dungeon is becoming a book called The Blades of Gixa, coming soon to Kickstarter. Go to paradiso.oo/Gixa to get on the mailing list to be notified when it launches. And finally, one last way to support the channel. When I was first looking into making a subscription website and newsletter, most of the options seemed pretty flawed in various ways. I'd be locked into the whims of some venture-backed company. I'd pay high fees, I wouldn't own my data, I wouldn't be able to customize what I was offering to people, and so on. But eventually I found Ghost, which is an open source, independent platform that you can self-host if you want, but which also offers very well-priced hosting. It's great. It's very easy to use, very customizable, and fully funded by its users. They also have an affiliate program. This is an affiliate link. So if you make a Ghost account using this link, and you end up deciding to pay for their hosting service, I get a small cut of what you pay at no cost to you. It'd be a huge help for the long-term sustainability of this project. Enough of that. This is Gravy. Gravy is a color, sort of, made by the Cypriot paint company, Warcolors. When you order from them online, you can add a bottle of gravy to your order for free. This is just a mix of whatever leftover paint they had lying around after mixing a batch, so no guarantees about color. Since this gravy is a kind of dark, desaturated green, I'm using it as a base color for foliage and mixing in some more saturated dark green as I go. I'm using a bit of sponge here to gently dab on some color variations. Sponges are great for getting a little modeling and texture, and it's a nice way to touch up areas where the color's not quite right without having to worry about brush strokes. It's also a nice way to break up areas of color if things start looking too uniform. Okay, and now I want to break up these stones a bit by varying the colors slightly. For a little more precision, I'm dabbing the paint on with the end of an old brush instead of a sponge, and just picking out certain stones or areas with cooler and warmer colors. And here I'm going to go a bit deeper into the shadows, mixing brown mostly with black and purple, adjusting with other colors to fit where I'm painting. For most of this, I want to be fairly precise. I'm using a smaller, pointed brush and tracing the cracks and crevices of each piece to get nice, defined details. In some other areas, I'll thin the paint to make a wash to seep into crevices, and then I'll wipe away the excess off the raised areas. Some paints have pigments that are attracted to magnets, probably iron oxide. Especially when used in a wash, these pigments can collect around the magnets and darken those areas. This isn't hard to deal with. While it's still wet, you can wipe these away, but keep an eye out. And I'm varying the colors a bit as I go. Here, for example, these tiles are quite a bit cooler than the surrounding stone, so I mix less brown and more purple in to match. So, meanwhile, back in Ozma, King Gamura's army marches on the Imperial Palace, the vanguard flying the slashed portrait of the Emperor as a battle flag. The vision of the Emperor's portrait cut from its frame neck slashed and flapping in the dusty wind, sends a shiver of fear through the palace's defenders. And when an advisor to the emperor stumbles out of his quarters, a bloody knife held above his head, shouting, "They've killed him, the emperor is dead," the guards are routed and the palace is lost. Rushing into the palace's labyrinthine halls, Gamura's soldiers quickly take control. They drag the emperor's corpse, blood dripping from the neck and streaking across the stone floor, into the center of the great hall and leave it there, small, crumpled, and sodden. Striding victorious through the imperial palace with Innes at his side, face as before obscured with helmet and shroud, King Gamura demands to be taken to the famed imperial vault, where the greatest riches and secrets of the empire are said to be held. The knife-bearing advisor leads Gamura, a small coterie of his most trusted lieutenants, and Innes and her manservant, down into the labyrinthine catacombs beneath the palace, to the imperial vault. Throwing the doors open, Gamura laughs in astonishment at the tremendous hoard of gold, ivory, jewels, and artifacts. Innes's eye, however, is drawn elsewhere. On the floor, leaning against an exquisite statue of a prescribed goddess, she sees herself in a painting, a small but careful study by her love, Argonum and Ulva. A painting she had never posed for, never seen before, never knew existed. Reflexively, she turns to stare at her servant. Ulva's eyes will not meet hers. She stares back down at the small painting, a painting depicting her fawning over him. Lifting it up, she sees that there's another and another one under that, and more of them beneath, each more lustful and lecherous than the last. As she staggers back, hurt, confused, a realization and an anger dawning over her, she bumps into the chest of King Gamura, who snatches the painting studies from her hands. The witch painter took a liking to you, did he? Jealous fool, to prize you so highly yet expose you so completely. I believe I shall add these to my collection, just like you. Picking one out, he traces a dagger along the brushstrokes. And where is your little lover now? Shaking, feeling a shiver run down her spine, she almost speaks. She almost looks again to Ulva in his disguise. But instead she looks down, staring holes through the floor, and gives a sharp shake of her head. The coward abandoned you. What a surprise. Gamura rolls the studies up and tucks them under his arm. Gesturing to the glittering splendor around them, he says, "Take whatever you want, my pet. I have what I need." That night, Gamura hosts a feast in the great hall, the emperor still in a congealed heap on the floor. His soldiers ring the room, backs to walls, eyeing the captive guests as they eat and attempt to converse as if nothing was wrong. The disguised Ulva stands at attention behind Innes, seated to Gamura's right. King Gamura smiles at his guests, a mix of Osman nobility and his own lieutenants, and announces that tomorrow he and Innes shall be wed, just as was promised him. As mandatory cheers and applause ring out, he leans over to Innes. "After all, I will need your legitimacy if I am to become emperor. Tonight you will stay in what were once your father's quarters. You will need to prepare for tomorrow, and perhaps it will bring you some comfort to be around his effects. And my father, what of him? All the court is here, yet he is not. What have you done with him?" "What have I done with him?" He laughs. "Not the right question, my pet." Ulva, just close enough to listen, tries not to visibly quake in his boots. After the feast, soldiers escort Innes up to her father's chambers. Seeing that Ulva is no longer by her side, she questions the guards. and they reassure her that he has simply gone to fetch her things and will be joining her shortly. As she enters the familiar room, the guards lock the door behind her. She sees that Gamora has had everything arranged for her. Candles and fireplace are lit, bed is made, and laying upon it is a single sheet of paper. Picking it up, she sees her father's face, wasted by disease, a horrible sight, painted by her lover, Arcanum Ulva. And at that moment, she knows he is not coming. She bangs on the locked door and demands to see Gamora. She has something important to tell him. To be continued after we talk about the foliage and other details. Ozma is pretty verdant, so I want to add in some more greenery. I used pre-made flock earlier, but here I want to show that you can use sawdust to much the same effect. You can pre-color it if you want by mixing in some paint, but here I don't bother. I just stick it directly on the pieces with some watered down Mod Podge. I'll apply paint afterwards. I also want to have some vines. I've used lichen before to imply these, but here I'm trying something a little different. I take some twine and partially unravel it, then soak it in PVA glue. This is pretty messy. And then I pop it on a piece. I'll have it coming out of this overgrown area, and I'll branch it a bit more. And add more PVA to hold it in place. Again, messy. I'd like to find a better way of doing this. And then some sawdust for texture. More vine type stuff. I'm back to using lichen and spritzing on a mix of Mod Podge and water to hold it in place. And another one growing into this little circular window. And some clump foliage flock, plus another lichen vine. You can also use coffee grounds for texture. Just save them after your morning cup and spread them out on a baking sheet. Then put them in the oven at very low heat, or a food dehydrator if you have one, till they're nice and dry. Coffee grounds can work as moss or grass, but might be better as dirt or gravel, depending on if it's ground for, say, espresso or French press, respectively. It's great for filling in crevices and corners. Now, all this texture is nice, but it's not as leafy as I'd like. So here I've rolled out some green stuff, epoxy putty, slathered with petroleum jelly, and sandwiched it between sheets of parchment paper, so I can get a nice, thin, flat sheet without it sticking to everything. Once that cures, I wipe the petroleum jelly off, and I slice it up into little diamond shapes, which approximate leaves reasonably well. Plus, since green stuff is very flexible when cured, it should be pretty durable. What we don't want are brittle leaves, which will snap right off. Ultimately, I needed even more leaves than that, so I thought I'd use my second batch to experiment with using paint instead. I just spread out some cheap acrylic paint on parchment paper and let it dry. The result doesn't come off quite as nicely, unfortunately, but once it's off, I cut the same tiny diamonds. A rotary cutter actually works pretty well for this. These paint leaves feel a little flimsy. I'd probably use a slightly thicker coat next time, but they work reasonably well. Materials-wise, they're cheaper than green stuff, and they have the added bonus that since they're just paint, they can be whatever color I want. Whatever material you use, it just takes some patience, CA glue, and a pointy tool to apply these to pieces. Generally, I put these together in little clusters, wherever I think the foliage texture could use a bit of a variation. They're also great to have poking out of cracks. These just add a little three-dimensional element. And they're especially useful for filling out these climbing and crawling vines. All this new foliage will then get painted with the same base coat as the rest of the greenery, because as you can see, I did a terrible job of color matching. Remember all those tiles I made a while ago? What if I added even more? I wonder how many of these I've made at this point. Okay, for all that stuff we just added, after the glue dries, I add more watered down Podge to lock everything in place and protect it. This textured plastic came from, I want to say, a big cup of pudding, something like that. I trace this hole with a paint marker, cut it out with the shop scissors, and pop it in for an inset grating and glue in place. There are some very, very thin jewelry chains out there. I got these stainless steel ones a while back, off eBay or AliExpress or something, and they'll work nicely at the 28mm scale. I just CA glue them to the pieces to look like random chain strewn about. The important thing is to use liquid, not gel glue, and to not use too much, or at least wipe away any excess. The detail on the chains is very fine, and if they get too gunked up with glue, it'll be hard to tell what they are once painted. You can also make a lot of details just with wire. This is the same wire I used earlier, 0.0253 inch brass wire. I mostly use it for miniature armatures, but here I'm using it to make bars for this window, or grate, with a generous helping of CA glue. I got a little set of wire bending pliers from Micromark a while back. They are by no means a necessity, but certainly nice to have. This one makes sharp bends, nice for getting around geometry like this, while this one is more curved. If you don't have these rather specialized tools, don't worry, you don't really need them. You can grab some wire with regular pliers and just bend it with your finger right next to where you've grabbed it, and you'll get a sharp corner. You can also wrap the wire around a curved surface like a pen to get a gentler turn. Wire this thin is quite pliable and easy to use. So here I'm running some wires out of this barred window, and as before, having a few parallel to each other just makes everything look more like it belongs. In the stairs episode, I used little strips of card as brackets to make it look like the cables were held in place. Here I'm doing the same thing, but with little strips of green stuff. It's already been cured, so I'm using CA glue to stick them to the piece and just pressing them around the wires until they set. Once those are in place, I put on tiny little rivets I punched out of pewter sheet with my rivet applicator, a toothpick. It's pretty fiddly, but a nice detail that I think is worth the effort. Here's how I make the rivets. This is a set of exceedingly small drill bits, and these ones in the front row are the big ones. So I pick a bit and put it in a pin vise backwards. So I have a cylinder with a flat end coming out of the handle. This is a 0.2 millimeter sheet of pewter. I lay it down on some rubber. I want something with a little give, and I just push the back of the drill bit right through. And there's your rivets. There are a billion ways to make rivets, but I like this method because I can make them whatever size I want just by using different drill bits. And they come out perfectly round with this nice, slightly domed shape. I haven't figured out what to do with the leftover pewter yet, but it seems like a cool texture. Or I don't know, maybe I could get a little miniature casting set up and melt it down. Maybe someday. This bit of card is going to be a decorative door. I've made square rivets by using a square driver bit and star-shaped rivets by using a Torx bit, using a hammer to drive them both through the pewter. And with that, I add a lot of little guys. Alright, I want this door to have a ring handle. This is pretty easy to make. I wrap wire around a toothpick to make a spring, essentially. Then I snip each loop of the spring. This makes these twisty little loops. Next, I just hammer them flat. And they're good to go. A little CA glue, a tiny bit of card to hide the seam, and that's a door. Then I prime it, paint it black, and then gold, and a little brown wash. And when it's partially dry, I wipe it away from the raised areas, and then I hit all these decorative elements with silver. And once that's done, another lighter brown wash to blend everything in. Moving on, this is another door I made out of card. It's got a more futuristic look to it. It'll also get one of these rings, which I attach with green stuff. I go over everything with a layer or two of silver paint, and when that's dry, another brown wash, with a little orange mixed in for extra rust flavor. Now I'll highlight the metal with a little silver mixed with white. It's pretty sloppy, but it's fine. A little extra rust will blend it all nicely. And I want to darken these insets with brown and black for more contrast. I feel like it needs a little something extra, so I'm giving it some yellow paint. But not everywhere. I want this to look worn, like the paint is slowly chipped away, revealing the metal underneath. I don't love this color, so at this point I opt to make it a little more orangey, and add another layer to get more coverage. Now to really sell the chipping paint, I'm outlining the yellow with some brown, like dirt's gotten caught in the seam. And then I highlight the paint with some brighter yellow, all along the edges. And the same color scheme for the vent on top of the same piece, just to tie them together. Dirty silver, yellow paint, some silver for a chipping effect and edge highlights, and brown outlines. Next, this more old-fashioned wooden door with metal bands and another one of those rings. The wood bits are made of actual wood, so I'm just dry brushing with progressively lighter shades of brown and tan to pick up the grain, focusing on the edges to really pick out individual boards. Next, I prime the metal bits, paint them black and silver. And as before, I rust it up with brown and orange, and wipe a bunch of it away before it's dried, so it just sits in the recesses. And the same with a bit of brown to pick out the details. So especially in the big flat areas, some of the colors can feel a bit splotchy and undefined. Plus there's a lot of texture I added with grout and all that that's getting kinda lost. So this next step, dry brushing highlights, tackles both issues. I make a lighter mix of my base stone color, Vallejo Flat Flesh, white, and a touch of azure, and put it on a larger, cheaper brush. I don't put much paint on the brush, and actually I wipe a fair bit off before I start painting. This is the essence of dry brushing. As the name implies, I want my brush to be almost dry. I want my paint to have basically zero flow, because I don't want it to seep into crevices or anything like that. I want it to stay just on the places my bristles touch, the most prominent points. This picks out and highlights the raised areas, while leaving the recesses untouched, which reveals a lot of texture and detail. And by going over everything with this color, it also helps unify the pieces. Even if there's lots of color variation in the crevices, the highlights make them feel more consistent. I don't hit everything with the same amount of highlighting either. I vary it up based on what kind of texture there is, how much I want to blend colors, and so on. This is a great way to manage some of the overspray from previous steps, especially the green foliage base color. I like having some of the overspray there to imply spreading moss, lichen, things like that, but the dry brushing tones it down nicely. There are also a bunch of these tiled areas that I can really make pop in this step. Next is edge highlighting, and for me, this is where the pieces really start to come together. Edge highlighting is just tracing certain edges of a piece with a lighter shade to pick them out. This allows me to really emphasize certain shapes and features, and it helps break up the color gradients I got from blending and overspray. Basically, it makes everything look more deliberate. Note that this is not dry brushing. I'm doing normal, wet painting, just with fine lines. As for color, I'm just working within my warm stone color spectrum, finding brighter versions of each area I'm highlighting. As an aside, you might notice that I'm sometimes holding onto my brush using a big piece of foam. This is a pencil grip I can stick onto my brushes so I don't have a cramped claw-like death grip while I'm painting. If your hand cramps up while painting, I'd give this a try. Please take care of your hands. So while I'm on this piece, this door needs some edge highlights too. I use a mix of gold, silver, and white to keep the metallic shine, but get a brighter tone to pick out the edges. Okay, how about we finish our story, huh? Innes convinces the guards at her door to take her to King Gamora. When she arrives, she tells Gamora she is ready to turn over the foul witch painter. Gamora laughs and says he knew she would come around, but when she tells him he was disguised as her servant, his eyes widen behind the veil. He calls for his men to find the rogue artist and bring him back, alive. Meanwhile, Ulva slips out of the palace through a small side entrance one of his patrons once showed him, hoping to slink back to his studio in Merz, unsure what he'll do once there, but knowing he must do something. But he is unfortunate to attempt his escape this night. The moons are out, and the streets glow with their cool light. As he tries to slip away, a shout in a foreign tongue rings out behind him. He turns for a moment and sees soldiers running from the palace. Breaking into a dead sprint, he throws himself into the twisting streets of the high city. He runs in blind fear, breath heaving, eyes watering, stammering out half-remembered prayers, cursing his fate and his talent. But perhaps his prayers were heard, or perhaps he simply knows the streets better than his foreign pursuers. But he puts some distance between them and finds, to his own surprise, that he has made it back to Merz and his studio. Entering the studio and locking and barricading the door behind him, Ulva knows it's only a matter of time before King Gamora's soldiers find him. He frantically paces the moonlit room where he had painted so many of the courtiers, the emperor, everyone who could protect him, now dead or brought to heel by Gamora. hearing the footsteps of his pursuers echoing through the alleys, Ulva stares up at the great painting that made his name, Merz. The monumental portrait of what was once a dismal neighborhood, reimagined as something grand. His eyes scan the familiar painting as if looking for clues, and they come to rest on his depiction of the narrow, rapid river that runs through the neighborhood. He rips the huge painting off the wall, crumpling it in his arms, clears his own barricade, and runs outside, out to the river. On its bank, he throws the painting to the ground and frantically tears it apart, throwing the scraps into the turbulent river, where they cavort and gamble as they flow out to sea. That was the last anyone would see of Argonaman Ulva. His pursuers, those that survived, reported becoming hopelessly lost as the streets and alleys began to shift and crumble in a storm of stone and splintering wood, shouts of confusion, terror, and pain ringing out from the Merzites in their homes. And the neighborhood of Merz falls even faster than it rose. It cracks apart, its stones shifting and clashing together, tilework jumbling madly to form strange geometries. The violent chaos of the earthquake eventually subsides, but the neighborhood is not merely destroyed, it is lost. As the painting fragments swirl through the sea's endless currents and eddies, parts of the neighborhood continue to emerge across the city. Half-buildings appear between homes that once abutted each other, alleys that were once dead ends now open into strange rubble-strewn twilight streets, and tomorrow will be dead ends once again. They say that night never ended in Merz, and whenever the moons are out and shining in the city of Ozma as they were that night, more of the lost district finds places to emerge. Many adventurers and treasure hunters have sought to find the lost studio of the witch painter, Argonaman Ulva, certain that it must someday appear again in the city. But as yet, none have found it, or none have spoken of what they have found. As for King Gamura and Lady Innis, they were wed. It was not a happy marriage, but it did secure their positions as Emperor and Empress. Emperor Gamura, who came from across the sea, was a skilled conqueror, but a less adept ruler of foreign lands. The subtle intrigue of the Osman court came to elude his coarse methods, and after fathering 2 daughters with Innis, he would soon find himself with a slit throat, bleeding out in a heap on the floor in the great hall of the imperial palace. Well, I hope you enjoyed the story and the highlighting. Let's paint some plants. I made all the leaves way too bright, so I'm painting them with the same base coat as the rest of the foliage, primarily refractive green. Once everything has that base coat, I start adding on layers of progressively lighter and yellower colors. I apply each foliage color layer with a slightly lighter touch than the one that came before it. I always want a bit of the previous layer peeking through in the recesses. As a result, each layer gets progressively closer and closer to dry brushing. I wait for each layer to dry before going back over them. When I'm working on this many pieces, this isn't really an issue because I do the first step on all the pieces, then the second step on all the pieces, and so on. So it's a long time before I circle back to a piece. Once I start mixing in yellows, the foliage starts looking a lot more interesting. It really starts to liven up and show its texture. Plus, now that it's not so dark, it looks a lot more like it belongs next to the stone. This works especially well with really three-dimensional stuff, like the leaves on the vine here. I imagine water collects in this triangular depression, and a lot of moss and stuff grows all over. So I'm happy to extend some of the green onto the flatter areas that would otherwise be stone, just to give them that mossy tint. While we're on the plants, how about a little fruit? These little blobs are from my hot glue gun, dribbling when I've just used it. I save them all in a little tin for times like these. First I gotta clean them up, pull all the wisps off. Then I use CA glue to glue them in various places where I think it'd be fun for the plants to be fruiting. Some of these I imagine are still ripening, so they're green. And when they ripen, they get kind of purpley red, with a little orange maybe. Speaking of misusing glue, This is JB Weld Epoxy. Be sure to use this stuff in a well-ventilated area, and wear a respirator. It stinks like hell. My idea here is to have some liquid dripping out of these little pipes and pooling on the ground. This epoxy is supposed to cure in 5 minutes, but it's just liquid enough that it's hard to make the connection from the pipe to the ground. I have to keep doing it until it stays in place. A better idea would have been to put a little piece of string or fishing line there for the epoxy to stick to as it cures. Oh well. So now I want to paint this up as some kind of sludge. Maybe these are sewer pipes. Who knows? Okay, I did some selective brown wash before, and I'm doing it again, but this time with oil paint. I'm using a pretty light touch here. I don't want to dull things down too much, so I avoid the more raised, bright areas. I go a little heavier on the greenery. This will help blend everything together and make sure that the texture really stands out. I also use the wash to make certain stones look a bit darker, just to add some variation. The process for making an oil wash is very similar to making an acrylic wash. You're just thinning the paint. For an acrylic wash, you just add water. Oil paint isn't water soluble, so you add mineral spirits instead. You can also do this step with an acrylic wash, no problem. I'm using an oil wash because it has a few properties I like. First, I like the deep, rich color I get from it. Second, I like the way it flows into crevices on the piece. It's just nice to work with. And third, oil takes way longer to dry. This means I can apply an oil wash to a whole batch of pieces and then come back with a rag to wipe the excess off of all of them in one go. If I wanted to do this with acrylic, I'd have to stop between each piece to wipe it down before it dries. So this is much more efficient. Now, you can go way heavier with the washes to make everything look really grimy and gritty and dirty, especially if you use a black wash. But that's not the look I'm going for here. I want a place that looks lived in, worn, heavily used, but not apocalyptic. I want some warmth. Ozma's an ancient city with plenty of ruins, but it's not a ruined city. I mean, it may have survived a few apocalyptic events, but it survived, you know? Once that wash is dry, it's time to brighten the greens back up with the final round of highlights. Since I used oil paints, I let these sit for a few days before doing this step. For the highlights, I want the paint to sit on top of the wash and not blend with it at all. So it's gotta be bone dry. And I'm adding brown to the vines for a bit of color variation. I want these highlights to really pop, so I'm going quite yellow with the color. As before, I have a lighter and lighter touch with each successive layer. By the last layer, I'm basically dry brushing. Okay, now this next bit is pretty fun. I'm excited to not be painting green. I'm getting into all the little details, bits and bobs. For metallics, I want to have a dark base coat, black or something close. And I just carefully apply silver paint, trying to keep it from seeping into the cracks. And if it does, it's fine. It's easy to touch up with some dark paint, but you know, an ounce of prevention and all that. Metallic paints have little reflective flecks in them, which apparently ruin brushes, so don't use a nice fancy brush for this. Or be like me and use a very old brush that was once nice and fancy in a previous life. Dry brushing can be good for larger metal areas like this. It's not a very precise technique, but it's a good, fast way to pick out all the raised bits in an area. Here I'm painting some of the cables and pipes running under the city streets. There are some advanced technologies here, though many are hidden from view, decrepit, deteriorating, and no one remembers how to work or maintain them. I like having these little hints peeking out of modernity grafted onto ancient infrastructure. Ooh, some more fruits. I'll use some of that extra red paint for a cable, and a few other colors too. A little black and purple to touch up and define the segments here. Oop, missed a cable. And we've got some more over here. They're a bit neater, so I need to be extra careful painting them. Going with yellow for this big coil of cable, or hose. What's it doing here? Any ideas? Maybe it's hooked up to some kind of magical energy conduit, or just a water main, who knows. Shade it with a little orange and highlight again with yellow. some more wood planks here and there. I start these dark brown and go progressively lighter and more tan, following the grain. Bits of gravel and dirt here. And now, since we have all this metal, a brown and orange wash for rust effects. You can see me using my finger to wipe away excess wash as I go. This step is pretty forgiving. It's totally fine to have some of the rust extend past the actual metal bits and stain the area around them. It can actually add quite a bit to the effect. It implies that these things have been out in the elements for a while, streaking rust as it rains and pooling it on the ground. Whenever I do a wash, I always wind up going back and doing some highlights afterwards. Washes are great, but they do dull everything down a bit, so it's nice to come back and selectively pick out bits with a highlight to brighten them back up. In this case, I'm being a little random with my silver highlights because I still want the metallic pieces to have that tarnished, patinaed look. I'll give some of the pipes an older, more terracotta look, complete with some cracks. I paint the cracks thin with a dark color that matches the overall hue, and then I highlight it with the same highlight color I use for the material. The skulls from the skull box get off-white paint with a brown wash. The texture on the plastic I'm using for this window is a bit subtle, so I'm picking it out to make it feel like it's made up of a bunch of diamond panes, and some little blue-white highlights to sell the effect. Here are some purple tiles that I quickly decided I didn't actually want to be purple. And this big fragmented piece is just a rectangle of card that I sliced up and pieced loosely back together. I want a nice even coat on this. Starting with some simple designs, dots of azure blue, which I will then outline. Next up, azure tiles with white circles, which need to get a bit bolder. And when they're dry, I can use a bit more azure to clean them up, and blend them in with a touch of grime. A little checkerboard pattern here, starting with white lines going up and across, and then the same thing with that azure blue on the white tiles. And then a little edge highlighting to finish them off. I'm back on my dots. But now these dots are getting surrounded by even smaller dots in the corners of each tile. And on the edges, why not? Turning my brush sideways, I can get these little flower petal or teardrop shapes. And once again, in edge highlight, more azure tiles. Time for something a little different, like some rectangular spirals. How about some bigger dots with little white dots inside? And these should be fairly gritty since they're at ground level. And these will have ellipses in boxes. Okay, starting off with a big version of those white ring tiles, which I double up, dots in the corners, little ring in the middle, and little nubs. That looks kind of like a sight, but whatever. And another one of these boxed ellipses. Okay, it's rare that I break out the pencil and do a sketch, but I want to have a little planning going into this one since it's fairly big. And paint. As long as we're sketching, how about another big tile design? This one will be more representational. A little landscape, a castle on a hill. And quickly get to painting. This bit is going to be solid blue. Get the outline and the cloud, fill in the sky, and shade the ground with some fine lines, as well as the distant mountain. This circle is literally just the head of a tack that, instead of hiding, I decided to feature, so why not make it a fancy tile? Starting with some circles, 4 dots around the outside, then fill the spaces between those dots, and then between those as well. A dot in the middle becomes a big disc, and inside that, 4 white dots complete the design. Here's the last set of tiles. So yeah, aside from the sketched ones, these are all just improvised as I go. But I did still have my tile concept sketches from the stairs episode, so it's not like I was going in totally blind. Plus it's easy to find a ton of photographs online of Portuguese azulejos, and Arabic mosaic. Check out episode 1 of Paradiso Craft to see how I made the stairs that you'll see accompanying these tiles at the end of the episode. They also feature similar azulejo style designs. Here I want to have a bunch of little dots around the edges. Turns out that's easier to do with just drops of white paint. Duh. Hey, finally we made it to the last step, varnish. Now that everything's done, it needs to be protected. I coat everything in gloss varnish, which is said to be the most durable kind. The bottoms get 3 coats. The tops and sides get 2. I have to wait for each coat to dry before I can put on the next one, and I'm making lots of these tiles, so this takes several days. And then of course I don't want the final pieces to actually be glossy on top, so once all that gloss varnish is on and cured, I add one last layer of matte varnish, specifically ultra matte varnish from AK. This stuff is really nice, and it does produce an ultra matte finish. It does usually require a bit of touching up, as the gloss varnish can make the matte on top bead a bit as it goes on, leaving little patches where the gloss shines through. This is easy to fix just by holding the piece up to a light and hitting the shiny spots with more matte varnish. The matte on top of gloss means that over time, if the matte rubs off, the pieces will become shiny in those areas, which will signal that they need to be touched up. Here you can get a sense of the transition from gloss to matte. Let's watch some varnish dry. Oh yeah. Before we look at the final results in action, a note about storage. I found that these pieces can stick together a little bit when they've been stored touching each other for a while. And that can result in some peeling. The varnish coats should help with that, but just to be safe, I've cut out little rectangles of parchment paper that I stick between the pieces when I store them on the shelf. The parchment paper stays behind when I'm using these pieces on a tabletop. And yeah, since everything stacks, all these pieces together don't take up much shelf space at all. As I mentioned at the start, these are all part of a system that I'm gradually building, as are the stairs from episode 1. These tiles are really the foundation, making up the game board that almost everything else will sit on top of. I'll still make other tiles with more defined features, like water perhaps, or more completely overgrown areas. And definitely more features like the stairs, buildings, walls, arches, fountains, columns, and so on. So what I'm putting together here is just the start of something I hope will be even more expressive and robust. But even now, there's enough going on to make a viable game board in a pretty much infinite number of configurations. So because these pieces are a bit abstract, they can be combined in a variety of ways to create interesting little areas, like this nook, this rooftop, and this open plaza. And in combination with other set pieces, like the episode 1 stairs here, I can create all kinds of pathways, sightlines, corridors, and scenarios. More of those to come. Here are a few beauty shots. Here's another quick demonstration of how these pieces can make a very different kind of board. I feel this approach to terrain makes creating the landscapes and play areas fun in itself. Prepping a game almost feels like its own game, like playing with chunky Legos. I plan to add onto this in future videos, so this won't be the last you see of these things. So what do you think of this system and this aesthetic? Let me know. Thanks again to my supporters at Paradiso.zone and YouTube for keeping this thing afloat. And to all of you watching this, you're the best.